bride's hand appears graceful, until historians enlarged the image. Dr. Evelyn Chase had examined countless wedding photographs from the post-Civil War era. But something about this particular image made her pause on a cold morning in February 2024. The photograph had arrived at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture as part of a donated collection from a church in Charleston, South Carolina. It showed a young black couple on their wedding day, dated on the back in faded ink, the 14th of June, 1868. The image was remarkably well preserved for its age, printed on heavy cardstock that had been carefully stored in a family Bible for more than a century and a half. The bride stood on the left wearing a simple but elegant light-colored dress, probably her best garment. Repurposed for the occasion with added lace at the collar and cuffs, her hair was pulled back severely, revealing high cheekbones and eyes that stared directly into the camera with an intensity that transcended the decades. The groom stood beside her, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder, dressed in a dark suit that appeared slightly too large, likely borrowed. His expression was solemn and dignified, carrying the weight of a moment he clearly understood as historically significant. It was 1868, just 3 years after the end of slavery, and only months after the ratification of the 14th Amendment granting citizenship to formerly enslaved people. What struck Evelyn most forcefully was the bride's hands. They were clasped at her waist in the traditional pose of Victorian wedding photography, fingers intertwined, positioned to display what would have been a simple wedding band. The hands appeared delicate, graceful, arranged with the careful propriety characteristic of formal portraits of the era. Yet, something felt off. The bride held her hands not quite naturally, the fingers positioned at a slightly awkward angle, as though she were deliberately arranging them to present only a specific view to the camera. Evelyn had seen this before: the subtle body language of someone concealing an injury. She set up her high-resolution scanner, the same equipment that had revealed hidden medical details in hundreds of historical photographs. The technology could expose textures, scars, and marks invisible to the naked eye. She placed the photograph face down on the scanner. Light swept across the 156-year-old image. As the scan appeared on her monitor, she began her routine. Adjust contrast, examine background details, study clothing and posture. Then, she zoomed in on the bride's hands. Her breath stopped. The magnification revealed what time and the limitations of the original print had concealed. The bride's hands were covered in scars, deep, textured scars that formed a landscape of damaged tissue across her palms, fingers, and wrists. These weren't the fine lines of age or the small marks of cooking accidents. These were the scars of severe burns, repeated trauma, and untreated healing. The bride had positioned her hands deliberately. Evelyn realized, showing mostly the backs and sides where the damage was less visible, hiding her palms and the worst of the injuries. But the scan revealed everything: puckered skin, contracted fingers, the evidence of pain no pose could mask. Evelyn sat back, shaken. This wasn't just a wedding photograph. It was evidence, a record of violence, of labor, of survival. And the bride had known exactly what she was doing when she posed. For the next hour, Evelyn examined every detail. The scarring was extensive and clearly old. The tissue showed the settled appearance of injuries sustained years before. The heaviest scarring covered the palms and finger pads, with additional marks visible on the wrists beneath the lace cuffs. The pattern told a story. These were not random burns, but injuries typical of contact with hot metal, open flames, or heated objects used as punishment. The wrist marks resembled rope burns or the cuts of restraints during struggle. Evelyn had spent years studying medical documentation of slavery, branding, whipping, burning, mutilation. She had seen the famous photographs of formerly enslaved people whose bodies bore the evidence of brutality. But those images had been created for abolitionist advocacy. This was different. This was a woman photographed on what should have been the happiest day of her life, carrying scars she could never fully hide but presenting herself with dignity. Evelyn called Dr. Marcus Webb, of the Atlanta Historical Society, her closest colleague and an expert in post-Civil War African American history. "Marcus," she said. "I need you to look at something." She sent him the scan. Moments later, she heard his sharp intake of breath. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "What did they do to her?" "That's what we need to find out." The photograph came from Mount Zion Church in Charleston, found inside a family Bible. The date, the 14th of June, 1868, was all they had. Charleston in 1868, Marcus murmured. Union occupation. The Freedmen's Bureau active. Black people voting. Legally marrying. Registering families for the first time. Whoever this couple was, they had been enslaved just 3 years before. And the scars, Evelyn said softly, are older than that. 2 days later, Marcus arrived in Washington with boxes of Charleston documents. Marriage registers. Freedmen's Bureau records. Church membership rolls. Newspapers. He spread them across Evelyn's table, assembling a timeline of black life in Charleston in the late 1860s. The city was in upheaval. The war had decimated the economy. The planter class had lost their wealth, and formerly enslaved people were suddenly citizens marrying, opening businesses, participating in politics, building communities. Marriage, Marcus explained, was one of the first acts of freedom. Enslaved people's unions had held no legal standing. Families could be separated at any moment. After emancipation, marriage became a declaration of humanity. Evelyn scanned the Freedmen's Bureau marriage register for the 14th of June, 1868. 17 marriages were recorded that day alone, many listing only first names or newly chosen surnames. One entry made her pause. Thomas Freeman and Patience, formerly enslaved, married the 14th of June, 1868, Mount Zion Church, Charleston. Witnesses: Reverend Samuel Green, Mary Freeman. Freeman, Evelyn read aloud. A common surname chosen by people newly freed. But the date, the church, the context, everything aligned. They might have found their bride. It was a declaration, Marcus confirmed. Taking the name Freeman meant you were no longer anyone's property. And look, they were married at Mount Zion, the same church where the photograph was donated. Evelyn felt a spark of hope. Thomas Freeman and Patience. That could be them. But we need more evidence. Marcus pulled out another document, the 1870 federal census for Charleston. I've already searched it. There's a Thomas Freeman, black, age 28, listed as a carpenter on street. And living with him, Patience Freeman, black, age 24, listed as keeping house. That's them, Evelyn breathed. It has to be. But Marcus's expression had darkened. There's something else in the census record. A notation beside Patience's name. He pointed to faint handwriting in the margin. Hands. Damaged. Unable to perform fine work. The room fell silent. That single notation, an observation by a census taker in 1870, confirmed what the photograph had revealed. Patience Freeman's hands had been so severely damaged that the injury was visible to a stranger, notable enough to be recorded in a government document. What kind of work does that to a person's hands? Evelyn asked, though she suspected she already knew. Marcus opened a thick folder compiled on Charleston's antebellum economy. Charleston's wealth came from rice plantations in the Low Country, cotton inland, and in the city, ironworks, foundries, and turpentine distilleries. Enslaved people worked in all of them, but the work that would cause burns like the ones in the photograph. He flipped to an 1850 business directory. There were 3 major ironworks before the war: the Charleston Iron Works, the Palmetto Iron Works, and Bennett's Foundry. All used enslaved labor. Evelyn understood immediately. Ironworks meant blast furnaces, molten metal, scalding tools. Injuries from such work were brutal, often untreated. We need to find out if Patience worked in one of these places, she said. We need to know what happened to her hands. The Charleston Iron Works had been one of the South's largest industrial operations, employing over 200 workers, most enslaved. Though partially destroyed during the Civil War, Its business records survived in the South Carolina Historical Society. Marcus traveled to Charleston for 3 days to examine them, while Evelyn continued her research in Washington. The ironworks had kept meticulous ledgers, production logs, inventory sheets, and disturbingly a record of enslaved workers hired from their owners. On Thursday evening, Marcus called, his voice shaking. "I found her. Patience. She's in the hiring records from 1,859 to 1,864. What do the records say?" She was hired out by her owner, Robert Middleton, who ran a rice plantation outside Charleston but rented out enslaved workers to city industries. Patience was assigned to the mold-pouring section. Evelyn's heart sank. That was the station where molten iron was poured into casts, one of the most dangerous positions in the entire operation. Patience would have been 13 years old in 1859. "There's more," Marcus said. "They kept injury records." He began reading. February 1,860. Patience. Burned hands from splashed iron. Treated with lard. 3 days. Recovery. August 1,860. Patience. Burned right palm from hot tongs. No treatment. Returned to work. November 1,861. Patience. Severe burns. Both hands. From spilled molten metal. Treated by Dr. Simons. 2 weeks recovery. "They kept burning her," Evelyn whispered, horror tightening her throat. "And they kept sending her back. The last entry is March 1,863. Marcus continued. Patience. Extensive burns to hands and wrists from furnace accident. Hands permanently damaged. Reassigned to cleaning and sorting work. After that, Patience disappeared from the hiring records. Middleton likely stopped renting her out because her hands were no longer profitable. Evelyn thought of the wedding photograph taken just 5 years later. Patience had been 21. Her hands carrying the evidence of 4 years of brutal labor that began when she was barely a teenager. "We need to know more about her life," Evelyn said. "Not just what was done to her. Who she became afterward. She survived this. She lived through slavery and freedom. She married. She built a life. That's the story we need to tell." Finding Patience. Freeman's own voice turned out to be unexpectedly possible. While searching the National Archives, Evelyn discovered a testimony Patience had given to the Freedmen's Bureau in November 1868, only 5 months after her wedding. Thousands of formerly enslaved people had submitted claims seeking unpaid wages, legal recognition of marriages, or reunification with family. Patience had filed a claim for compensation for her labor at the Charleston Iron Works. Her testimony, recorded by Bureau Agent Jonathan Webster, had survived in full. Testimony of Patience Freeman, colored, formerly enslaved by Robert Middleton of Charleston District. Given the 18th of November, 1868. I am 22 years old. I was born on Mr. Middleton's plantation. When I was 13, he hired me to the Charleston Iron Works. I worked there from 1859 until 1863. My job was to help pour the melted iron into molds. It was hot work and dangerous. Many people got burned. I was burned many times. The first time was just a splash on my hand. It hurt terrible, but they put grease on it and made me go back to work the next day. After that, I got burned more times. Small burns and big ones. The masters didn't care much about burns unless you couldn't work. In 1863, a crucible tipped over and splashed on my hands and arms. The skin came off in sheets. When it grew back, it was hard and tight. I couldn't open my fingers all the way. I couldn't hold small things. My hands hurt for 2 years. Mr. Middleton was angry because I couldn't work at the ironworks anymore. He put me to cleaning rice and sorting bowls. When freedom came, I was glad because I thought I wouldn't have to work at hot iron anymore. I am married now to Thomas Freeman, who is a carpenter. I keep house for him, but my hands make it hard to do fine cooking or sewing. I am filing this claim because I worked 4 years at the Charleston Iron Works and never got paid 1 cent. All the money went to Mr. Middleton. I think I should get something for my labor and for my hands that got ruined in his service. Signed with her mark, as patients cannot write due to hand injuries. Evelyn read the testimony 3 times, tears blurring the page. Patience's voice rose clearly across more than a century and a half. Plain-spoken, resolute, painfully honest. She didn't ask for pity. She asked for justice. The note signed with her mark struck Evelyn hardest. Whether Patience could not write because she had never been taught, or because her hands could not hold a pen, the result was the same. She had insisted her story be recorded. Marcus found the claim's outcome in the bureau records. Claim denied. No legal obligation to compensate labor performed during slavery. Petitioner may seek redress through civil courts. Patience received nothing. The hands ruined in Middleton's service. The years of forced labor. The permanent disability. None of it qualified her for compensation in 1868, but she had tried. She had spoken. She had ensured that history recorded her name, her pain, and her demand for recognition. And 6 months before giving that testimony, she had stood with Thomas Freeman in front of a camera, her scarred hands carefully arranged to create another kind of record. A declaration not of injury, but of dignity. A declaration of life. While Evelyn pieced together Patience's testimony, Marcus traced Thomas Freeman through carpentry records and city directories. What he found would add vital context to the wedding photograph and help explain how Patience found not just a husband, but a man who understood the weight of everything she carried. Thomas appeared in Freedman's bureau records from 1865, immediately after Charleston's liberation. He had filed for a certificate of freedom and registered his name. Thomas Freeman, age 25, formerly enslaved by the estate of Charles Morrison. The records listed him as a skilled carpenter, trained in furniture making and construction. But it was Thomas's own testimony, given in 1867 when he petitioned to establish a carpentry workshop, that revealed his connection to Patience's experience. I learned carpentry working at Morrison's furniture workshop in Charleston, he told the officials. I was trained from age 12 to make fine furniture for white families. Morrison hired me out to other carpenters and kept all my wages. In 1861, when the war started, he contracted my labor to the Confederate government. I was sent to build fortifications and gun carriages. For 3 years, I worked building war machines. Many men died building those fortifications, shot by Union guns, killed in accidents, worked to death. I survived because I had a skill they needed. In 1864, I was assigned to the Charleston Iron Works, making wooden molds and patterns for the foundry. That is where I met Patience. She worked pouring the melted iron into the molds I built. I saw what that work did to people's hands and bodies. I saw Patience get burned badly. They made her keep working even when her hands were wrapped in bandages. When freedom came in 1865, I promised myself I would use my carpentry skill to build a good life. I also promised that if Patience survived the war, I would find her and ask her to marry me, because I saw her courage every day at that iron works. I saw her keep working even with damaged hands. I saw her help other workers, teaching them how to avoid burns, how to handle the hot metal safely. She was the bravest person I ever knew. Marcus called Evelyn as soon as he found this testimony. They knew each other during slavery, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thomas watched Patience suffer those injuries. He witnessed what the iron works did to her, and he spent 3 years after emancipation searching for her so he could marry her. Evelyn understood immediately what this meant for the wedding photograph. Thomas's hand on Patience's shoulder wasn't just a formal pose. It was a gesture of protection, of understanding, from someone who knew exactly what her scarred hands represented. He had seen her burned. He had watched her suffer. And he chose to build a life with her, not despite her damaged hands, but in full knowledge of the courage it had taken to survive. The photograph takes on completely new meaning, Evelyn said. This isn't just a wedding portrait. It's a reunion. Two people who survived slavery together, found each other in freedom, and chose to create a legal, recognized marriage. Thomas knew about her hands. He testified about seeing her burned, and he married her and built a life with her. Oh, there's more, Marcus added. I found Thomas's business records from his carpentry workshop. Between 1868 and 1890, he employed over 30 people, all formerly enslaved, many disabled or injured. There are notes in his account books. James, missing right hand, trained for one-handed planing. Samuel, burned arms, assigned to sanding and finishing. Thomas created a workshop specifically designed to employ people whose injuries made them supposedly unemployable. Unflued. One-to-one Thomas, unflued. He was building the world he wished had existed for Patience, Evelyn said softly. Exactly, and Patience worked with him. I found references to her in his business correspondence. She couldn't do fine carpentry with her damaged hands, but she managed the workshop's finances, negotiated contracts, and handled customer relations. They were partners in every sense. The 1870 census that had first confirmed Thomas and Patience Freeman's identities also revealed another crucial detail that Marcus had initially overlooked. Freeman, Thomas Head, aged 28, carpenter. Freeman, Patience wife, age 24, keeping house. Freeman, Clara, daughter, age 1. They had a daughter. Born in 1869, just 1 year after their wedding, Clara Freeman represented the first generation of her family born into legal freedom. She was born to parents whose marriage was recognized by law, to a household headed by a skilled craftsman and managed by a woman who had survived the worst cruelties of slavery. Evelyn traced Clara through later census records and city directories. In 1880, at age 11, she was listed as attending school. A simple notation that carried enormous weight. Patience, forced into ironworks labor at age 13, had ensured that her daughter would receive an education. By 1900, Clara had married a teacher named James Stevens and was living in Philadelphia, part of the Great Migration. The census listed her as a seamstress, fine work requiring the delicate finger control her mother had lost. Marcus then found Clara's name in the Philadelphia chapter records of the National Association of Colored Women. She had joined in 1901 and served on the Committee for Industrial Education, advocating for job training programs for young black women. In 1908, Clara gave a speech at the organization's annual convention. The speech had been preserved, and one passage made both researchers stop breathing. My mother's hands were destroyed by slavery. She worked in an iron works in Charleston, pouring molten metal, and the work burned her hands so severely that she carries the scars to this day. She cannot sew fine seams or write letters or do many tasks that require delicate finger work. But she raised me to value education and skill. She made sure I learned to do the work her damaged hands prevented her from doing, and she taught me that survival is not enough. We must build lives of dignity and purpose. We must create opportunities for the next generation that were denied to us. My mother's scarred hands built my future. I carry her courage with me every day. Evelyn and Marcus sat in silence after reading that passage. The wedding photograph, taken in 1868 when Clara was not yet born, had captured the moment when Patience and Thomas chose to create that future, to build a family, to establish a legal marriage, to claim their right to raise children in freedom. We need to keep tracing the family line, Evelyn said. We need to find out if any descendants are still alive. They deserve to know this story. They deserve to see that photograph and understand what it represents. Marcus nodded and began the painstaking genealogical research. Clara had 4 children, all of whom attended college, an extraordinary achievement for the grandchildren of enslaved people. Her youngest daughter, Dorothy, became a social worker and was active in the civil rights movement. Dorothy's daughter, Patricia Morrison, was still alive, now 78, living in Silver Spring, Maryland. just 15 miles from Evelyn's office. "We found Patience Freeman's great-great-granddaughter," Marcus said, "and she lives right here in the DC area. I think it's time to make a call." Evelyn spent an hour preparing what to say before dialing Patricia. How do you tell someone you've found their ancestor's wedding photograph and that it reveals hidden trauma and survival? How do you explain that a simple image from 1868 carries a story of suffering, resilience, and triumph that has never been told? Patricia answered on the second ring, warm and curious. "Yes," she said. She had spent 20 years researching her family tree. Yes, she had traced her line back to Thomas and Patience but had hit walls trying to learn about their enslaved years. Evelyn took a breath. "I found their wedding photograph. The 14th of June, 1868. Mount Zion Church in Charleston. And the photograph reveals something about your great-great-grandmother that I don't think the family knew." A sharp intake of breath. "I'm sending it to you now," Evelyn continued, emailing the high-resolution scan. A long silence. Then Patricia whispered, "That's them. That's really them. We lost almost everything in a fire in the 1920s. We have stories, but no photographs. This is extraordinary." "Now," Evelyn said gently, "look closely at Patience's hands. Tell me what you see." Another silence, broken by Patricia's trembling voice. "Scars. Her hands are covered in scars. Oh my God. What happened to her?" Over the next hour, Evelyn told Patricia everything they had uncovered. She described the Charleston Iron Works hiring records and the injury logs. Patience's testimony to the Freedmen's Bureau. Thomas's account of witnessing her suffering, and Clara's speech detailing her mother's damaged hands. She explained how Patience had positioned her hands in the wedding photograph to conceal the worst of the scarring, how she had built a full life despite permanent disability, and how she had raised a daughter who became an advocate for industrial education. Patricia cried through much of the conversation, but her tears were layered pain, recognition, relief. "I knew there was trauma in our family history," she said softly. "We all knew our ancestors had been enslaved. But we didn't know the details. We didn't know what specifically had been done to them. My grandmother, Dorothy Patience's great-granddaughter, used to say, 'Our people survived the unsurvivable.' I never fully understood what she meant until now." "There's something else," Evelyn said gently. "Your great-great-grandmother's hands were damaged, but look at what she built anyway." She raised Clara. She helped Thomas run his carpentry workshop. She managed finances and negotiated contracts despite not being able to write. She survived, Patricia. And she made sure her daughter and granddaughter had opportunities she never had. Patricia's voice steadied as she considered the wedding photograph. "She's not hiding in that picture," she murmured. "She's standing there with Thomas, looking straight at the camera." She knew her hands were scarred. She knew the photographer would see. But she posed anyway, because she wanted a record of her marriage, her freedom, her new life. "Exactly," Evelyn said. "That photograph is an act of courage. Your great-great-grandmother was claiming her right to be seen, to be documented, to be remembered as a bride and a wife and a free woman, not just as someone who had been damaged by slavery." Patricia took a long breath. "When can I see the photograph in person? And what happens to it now?" "That's what I'd like to discuss with you," Evelyn replied. 4 months later, Evelyn stood in the exhibition hall of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture as visitors gathered around a new installation titled "Hands That Built Freedom: The Story of Patience Freeman." At the center of the display was the 1868 wedding photograph, enlarged to reveal both the formal grace of the portrait and the devastating detail of Patience's scarred hands. But it was not alone. Surrounding it were the documents that told the larger story. Charleston Iron Works injury logs, Patience's testimony to the Freedmen's Bureau, Thomas's petition to establish his carpentry workshop, census records charting the family's growth, Clara's speech describing her mother's courage, and photographs of the Freeman Stevens descendants across 5 generations. The centerpiece of the extended display was a second photograph taken by Evelyn only 2 months earlier. Patricia Morrison and 15 members of the Freeman family, spanning 4 generations, standing at Mount Zion Church in Charleston, on the exact spot where Patience and Thomas had been married 156 years before. Patricia held a framed copy of the 1,868 wedding portrait, completing a circle more than a century and a half in the making. The exhibition text told Patience's story plainly, neither diminishing the brutality she endured nor reducing her to a victim. Patience Freeman was 13 years old when she was forced to work at the Charleston Iron Works, one of the most dangerous industrial sites in the antebellum South. She handled molten iron and worked near furnaces that reached over 2,000 degrees. She was burned repeatedly. In 1863, a catastrophic accident left her hands permanently scarred. 3 years later, she was free. In 1868, she married Thomas Freeman, a skilled carpenter who had witnessed her suffering and had promised to find her after emancipation. In this wedding photograph, she carefully positioned her hands to show dignity rather than damage, though modern high-resolution technology reveals what she could not fully hide: the permanent evidence of slavery's cruelty. Patience lived until 1891. She raised a daughter who attended school and became a seamstress. She helped Thomas run a carpentry workshop that employed formerly enslaved workers whose disabilities made them unemployable elsewhere. She managed finances, negotiated contracts, and built a life of purpose despite injuries that prevented her from doing fine work. This photograph is many things: evidence of trauma, a record of survival, a celebration of love, and a declaration that damaged hands could not destroy human dignity. Patience posed, knowing her scars would be visible. She claimed the right to be remembered as a bride, a wife, and a free woman building a future. Her hands built that future. 5 generations of her descendants carry her courage forward. Patricia attended the opening ceremony with 12 family members, including her granddaughter, 7-year-old Patience Morrison, named after her great-great-great-grandmother. The child stood transfixed before the enlarged photograph, studying the woman whose name she carried. "Why are her hands like that?" the little girl asked. Patricia knelt beside her. "Bad people hurt her when she was young. They made her do dangerous work, and she was burned. But she survived. She got married. She had a family, and because she was so brave and strong, you're here today." The little girl pressed her small, unmarked hand against the glass that protected the photograph, touching the image of Patience Freeman's scarred palm. "I'm glad she didn't give up," she whispered. In the months that followed, the story of the photograph spread beyond the museum. Journalists wrote about the hidden scars revealed by imaging technology. Medical historians analyzed the injury patterns to better understand the toll of industrial slavery. Genealogists used the Freeman case as a model to trace other families whose histories had been fragmented, but the most profound impact came from other families who recognized themselves in Patience's story. Letters and emails poured in, descendants of enslaved people sharing their own fragments of history. A name in a ledger, a brief notation in a census, a fading photograph no one had ever examined closely. A woman in Atlanta sent a photograph of her great-great-grandfather, who had worked at the same ironworks. High-resolution scanning revealed similar scarring. Another family in Baltimore sent records of an ancestor who had lost 3 fingers working in a turpentine distillery. They had never understood the context until now. Evelyn launched a new initiative, the Scarred Hands Archive, collecting photographs, documents, and testimonies, revealing the physical evidence of slavery's violence. Patricia joined her as a descendant advisor, helping families navigate the emotional weight of discovering such truths. "People ask me if I'm traumatized," Patricia said during a public panel, 6 months after the exhibition opened. "But I'm not traumatized. I'm empowered. It hurts to see what my great-great-grandmother endured, but it's also powerful to see what she built. She survived. She created opportunity. She built a future. That's not a story of victimhood, it's a story of triumph." She gestured toward the wedding photograph projected behind her. Look at how she stands. She isn't hiding. She's looking straight at us, saying, "This is who I am. This is what I survived. And I am still here." That's the story I want my grandchildren to know. Late that evening, after the museum closed, Evelyn returned to her office. The wedding photograph lay on her desk, a high-quality print she kept as a reminder of why the work mattered. Patience. Freeman's eyes met hers across 156 years, defiant, unbroken, unerasable. Patience had stood before the photographer in 1868, knowing the image might outlast her. She was right. The photograph had survived a century and a half, through a family Bible, a church archive, and finally, a museum capable of revealing its hidden truths. The scars Patience once tried to conceal had become testament not to her victimization but to her extraordinary endurance. Evelyn opened her file of unscanned post-Civil War photographs, dozens of faces waiting to be seen clearly for the first time. Somewhere in those images were other Patiences, other scars, other untold histories. She began scanning the next photograph, watching as the image slowly sharpened on her screen, searching for the details that had waited more than a century to be recognized. On her desk, Patience Freeman's scarred hands faced the light hands burned by iron, denied wages, yet used to raise a daughter, run a business, and build a life of integrity. Hands that built freedom one scarred finger at a time, one day at a time, one generation at a time. And 5 generations later, a little girl named Patience could stand before a museum display and say, "I'm glad she didn't give up. She never did."